Throughout most of history, European empires have controlled the world order. This is because Europe was one of the first areas of the world to industrialize. Guns, trains, factories gave the Europeans an edge over the other areas in the world. The Spanish and Portuguese colonized South America, creating coastal cities around the continent, and the British and French found North America, and people from all over Europe began exploring the new landmass. Since the British were isolated from the European land wars, they built warships and were able to control the world's oceans. In the US, people revolted from the British control and established independence. The US had a civil war between the North and the South, and then went on to expand the population and economy. The US was able to purchase Louisiana from the French, and then had a war with Mexico, where it was able to gain land in California, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. After the Napoleon Wars, the Spanish had lost much of their strength because many of its South American colonies went independent. After an American warship was sunk in Cuba during the Cuban independence movement, the Americans created a blockade in order to support the Cuban independence, and after several naval battles in the Pacific and Atlantic, a peace treaty was signed. The Americans were able to gain all of Spain's Pacific territories and temporary control over Cuba. The United States was now very powerful, but it wouldn't show its strength until World War I. The British designed new warships, and the European and American navies modernized and grew. Germany unified and began to build its army and navy in order to secure a place in the new world order. The Europeans, who now had powerful empires and armies, were looking for war. Then World War I began. Europe was plunged into a war where its industries and populations were devastated. The US eventually joined the UK and France in their war against Germany. The US emerged more powerful than many European countries. The US made military treaties to restrict the size of the most powerful countries' militaries in an attempt to stop future conflicts. The USA's future rival, the Soviet Union, was also created. During World War I, Germany and Russia also waged a war on each other, leading to the collapse of the Tsar government and the Russian Revolution. The new socialist government was created, leading to the deaths of millions of people in the Soviet Union. After World War I, the League of Nations was created in order to keep the peace, but the League would fail in stopping Germany in World War II. World War II started as Germany began their invasion and occupation of Europe. The US didn't want to enter another European war and stayed out of it until the Japanese Empire, eager to gain power in the Pacific, bombed Pearl Harbor, and Germany declared war on America. The US was able to defeat the Italians in the Mediterranean, then they pushed back the Japanese in the Pacific. They crushed Germany between them and the Soviet Union. The US had an option to pull back into isolation or become the world power they would come to be. America developed a hatred for communism and tried to restrict the Soviet Union from taking over Europe. They did this and established the defense group NATO in order to protect the democracies of Europe. The Cold War started and arms build-ups and spying began. The US demonstrated their power by going into the Korean and Vietnam Wars to stop the spread of communism. The Soviets supplied other communist countries, but due to economic problems, the Soviet Union fell and was divided. The democratic powers of Europe and America relaxed, but then the Middle Eastern War started. The US invaded Iraq twice and then Afghanistan after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Europe, which housed many of the world's global powers like France, Germany, and the UK, became weaker, as the Europeans had been replaced by the United States as the number one superpower of the world, but also due to the extreme denazification of Europe. The Europeans were terrified of creating another fascist country, and national pride and nationalism was removed, leading to the weak Europe we see today. The Europeans have big economies and lots of roads, but in terms of military power, they are weaker than they were before. NATO is a military alliance made up of the majority of European countries, the United States and Canada. This alliance is held together by the US, which is carrying Europe. During the War on Terror, the Europeans supported the US in fighting Iraq, the Taliban, and ISIS. The war in Syria has forced millions of people to leave and head to Europe. This is one of Europe's modern problems, as millions of refugees who could be Syrian fighters and terrorists have entered Europe. The Europeans have also made a terrible mistake in trusting Russia. They allowed themselves to rely on Russian gas and fuel, and now that the Russians have invaded Ukraine and are threatening NATO, their mistake has been realized. This is Europe's part in the world order. As the US gained power after World War II, they formed allies across the world and are able to project military power anywhere at any time. This is the modern world order, where the US has become a global police force. The world cultures are becoming more like the American-dominated West, and the global economy is largely controlled by the capitalist Western nations. But recently, a new powerful force threatens to reorganize the world order. China has become increasingly more powerful and is one of the richest countries in the world. China is a communist nation, and fears like the days of the Cold War are returning. Russia, the shadow of the old Soviet Union, has made an alliance with China against the US and its allies. Several nations are turning to China for economic aid. This is expanding China's reach across the world. China's allies, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea, have been threatening US allies for years now. As China becomes more powerful, a massive third world war becomes increasingly more likely. Taiwan holds enormous strategic importance, and the majority of the world's computer chips are from there. The US now has to decide where it wants to focus more. Does it leave the Middle East? Does it split its focus on China and Russia? Or does it leave China alone to dominate the Western Pacific? These are the questions that the US has to answer soon. It appears as though China is considered the US's biggest threat, but the White House has also been sinking money into Ukraine, even as the global economy gets worse and worse. The future of the world lies on the hands of the European, Russian, Chinese, and US politicians. This is the US controlled world order that is being challenged by China and its allies. Thank you for watching.